Chapter 9 is focusing on the creation of the Articles of Confederation and the U.S. Constitution from 1776 to 1790. Now, to begin, after the American Revolution was over, there is an excessive amount of revolutionary idealism following the war. People on this high of all men are created equal. So trying to create more equality within society. Getting rid of the policy of primogeniture, where property automatically went to the oldest son. Instead, now property would be divided equally between the heirs of people. Reducing property requirements when it comes to voting. Basically giving more people the ability to participate in government, have more economic opportunities. We also start to see the beginnings of separation of church and state. Churches stopped being state-run, state or tax-supported. The Anglican Church was reformed into the modern-day Episcopalian Church. We also see in Virginia the creation of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, really focusing on people being able to practice their religion the way they want to. Also part of this anti-slavery movement that all men are created equal, we see some people choosing to give their slaves freedom after the American Revolution. The Continental Congress actually called for the abolition of the slave trade. However, this obviously would have torn the United States apart right then at the beginning of the United States, and so this really did not go through. In exchange for keeping the South tied to the United States, the anti-slavery movement kind of died out. That'll be dealt with later on, obviously, for the American Revolution. Also, when it comes to women's rights, there really wasn't an expansion for women's rights. Even though Abigail Adams had urged her husband to remember the ladies, this really didn't happen. Women weren't granted that many more rights under the new American government. But what they were given was a new responsibility, this idea of Republican motherhood. And these are obviously historians attributing this to the era, women have this new role. They are put up on a pedestal, that it is their job to instill in the children, or to instill in their children, this love of government, this civic virtue, that you should give up your selfish needs in exchange for what is good for the country. So this job was given to women because they are obviously the ones raising the children. So while women were not given more rights, what they were given was a lofty responsibility to raise good Republicans for the good of the United States. Now, when it came to the economy under the new U.S. government, there's a lot of economic problems. But one thing that they did have going for them was the fact that there's a lot of cheap available land. Royal land had been confiscated. Many of the Loyalist land had been confiscated. So America has land to sell off in order to help with these economic problems. Also, there had been some inroads made into creating a manufacturing class in America. Specifically during the Revolution, the United States had not been trading, obviously, with Great Britain for manufactured product. So this had opened up a door for Americans to create businesses and thus create manufactured goods. However, the problem after the American Revolution was over, and once the United States did start trading with Great Britain again, many of these British manufactured products were dumped on the American economy, meaning they were sold at a very, very cheap rate, and so many of these American companies actually went out of business. It's still a long time coming before the Industrial Revolution and America becomes a true manufacturing country. For the time being, America was obviously an agricultural society. Also, when it came to the economy, there was massive inflation, sometimes as high as 300%, meaning the value of the American currency was almost worthless in the eyes of not only the American people, but the world as well. People were focusing on speculation, meaning buying stuff at a low price and trying to sell it off later at a high price. Specifically, this pertains to war bonds that had helped finance the war. The problem was, though, that these war bonds, or this loan that was made to the U.S. government, was next to worthless. And this is going to be an issue that the new American government has to face. How can we create a strong, stable currency, and so we are not the laughingstock of the rest of the world? But the most major problem that America faced at this time was, are there enough similarities to hold this shaky country together? Remember, all of the colonies had been formed by different groups of people for different reasons at different times in our founding. The only thing that had really brought us together prior to this was a common enemy, was this British opposition. That opposition is now gone. Is there enough still holding us together to keep Virginia and Massachusetts and South Carolina all tied together? Is there enough to create a United States, or should they just split off right then and there and become small independent countries like we see in Europe? And so the first form of government under the United States is a confederation. Up till 1781, there was no true and legitimate government. The Continental Congress was really operating with no authority because there was no governing document that gave them that authority. So the reality was we were 13 sovereign states that had declared their independence. And so in 1777, a new form of government was proposed, the Articles of Confederation, but was not actually ratified, meaning approved of by the states, until 1781. And the reason that this got held up so long, because each state had to say whether they agreed to the Articles or not agreed to the Articles, was this Western land dilemma. There were 6 states who had Western land holdings, meaning they had land in the western portion of what is now the United States, that they personally owned. The 7 states who did not own land in the West said that this is not fair that these states have this land, that they can sell off that land and pay off their personal war debt, while us 7 states are just going to have to flounder and deal with our own state war debts. So until those 6 states give up their western land for the benefit of everyone, they give it to the United States government, we refuse to ratify these Articles of Confederation. So finally, in March of 1781, Maryland, being the last state to ratify, agreed to the Articles of Confederation when New York and Virginia finally gave up their western land claims for the common benefit, for the good of everyone. And eventually this territory would become states, or the Northwest Territory, as we'll talk about later. So this first form of government, what did it look like? First and foremost, it was a loose link of independent states. At the heart of the Articles of Confederation, their focus is on strong states' rights. That we are 13 independent states that are just coming together through a loose affiliation for common issues. That's what a confederation is. They had a one-house legislature, or a unicameral legislature, where each state got 1 vote. Obviously, this then was appealing to the small states because they got more than representation in Congress as compared to the larger states. There was no executive branch, meaning there was no president, there was no king, and that was done very intentionally. The Founding Fathers wanted to ensure that the United States did not create another Great Britain. They did not want to get into another situation where a very powerful king was telling them what to do. So they intentionally left out the executive branch for that exact reason. They also did not have a federal judicial branch, meaning there was no Supreme Court, only state courts. They intentionally left the federal government weak. They wanted to ensure that the majority of the governing was being done by the states. And any bill that was to become a law needed 9 of the 13 states to approve it. This was also done intentionally because they wanted to ensure that passing laws was not an easy thing. They wanted to ensure that the majority of the people actually wanted that law to be passed before it could actually be passed. And any amendment to the Articles of Confederation needed unanimous ratification, meaning all 13 states had to agree if any change was to happen to the Articles of Confederation. So all of this was done purposefully, creating a weak central government to ensure that the states retained their power. Now, also with the weak central government, or a weak Congress, because that is the only branch of government in the central government at this time, Congress had no power to regulate trade between the states. So we do start to see problems develop with this later on. States charging each other tariffs as if they were independent countries, states printing their own money, which is obviously going to lead to high inflation. Congress also had no power to demand their tax contribution. They were relying on that civic virtue that people would voluntarily give up the tax contribution for the central government. The reality was that people were more focused on paying off their own state debts and dealing with their own state issues, and so Congress only on a regular basis got about 1/4 of the tax revenue that they needed in order to pay off their debts and to achieve greatness in the United States. Without an executive branch, and an executive branch's job is to control the citizens or to enforce the laws, there was no control over the states. There was no control over the citizens. All of this was left up to the states to do. So the problem comes in 1783 when Congress, sitting in Philadelphia, was forced to flee Philadelphia when an angry mob of Revolutionary War veterans marched on Philadelphia demanding their back pay that they still had not received from the Revolutionary War. Congress had no power to raise an army. They'd asked Pennsylvania to raise an army to protect them. Pennsylvania refused, so literally the congressman had to run away from Philadelphia. This is an eye-opener to Congress that maybe we need a constitution. Maybe we need a stronger central government that's able to control the citizens. Here is the original document of the Articles of Confederation. Now, out of the Articles, even though there was a lot that was wrong with it, that obviously was going to be changed later on, there was a lot that was right about it too. Two major pieces of legislation came out of the Articles of Confederation, which is very important for the United States today. Both of which deal with the Northwest Territory. Now, the Northwest Territory is all of the land northwest of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi and south of the Great Lakes. So we're talking about Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, this area. That is part of the Northwest Territory. Now, the first major piece of legislation was the Land Ordinance of 1785. This provided that the Northwest Territory, and this is all that western land that those 6 states were required to give up, would be sold off to pay off the national debt. They also created an organized way to survey this land into 6 square mile township parcels. 36 one-mile parcels would be sold off to people in an organized fashion, and one of those parcels would be used for education. So this is important, number one, because it's ensuring that education moves westward, but it's also giving an organized way to keep control over this land, to sell it off, to ensure that the national debt is being paid off. Also passed in 1787 under the Articles of Confederation was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So this Northwest Territory, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, etc., this provided for a government while they were in their territory status to ensure that chaos did not reign in the Northwest Territory. It also gave them a vehicle to someday apply for statehood, that once these territories reached 60,000 inhabitants, they could apply to Congress to become a full member of the United States. And one other major important piece for the Northwest Ordinance is it outlawed slavery in the Northwest Territory. So there was never slavery in this region, which is also going to be a bone of contention later on. So 2 major pieces of land legislation that came out of the Articles of Confederation. Now, also under the Articles of Confederation, there's a lot of chaos, not only in controlling the population, but also when it comes to the economy. Without the proper tax revenues to be generated by the states, the central government has no international credit. Number one, it's difficult for them to pay off their debts that they still owe to foreign countries. And number two, it's difficult to get new loans from foreign countries for all the projects that the U.S. Congress wanted to enact. The fact that states were charging tariffs against each other only sought to increase economic problems within the United States, and the fact that each state was printing their own money only added to the depreciated value of the paper money. In 1786, though, one event really opened the eyes of the Founding Fathers that it's time to change this system. In western Pennsylvania, Daniel Shays led a rebellion against the U.S. government. They were angry because their farms were being foreclosed upon. They did not have the money to pay back the banks or their creditors who they owed money to, and so a huge rebellion was launched. Their demands, they wanted cheap paper money in order to be able to pay off their debt quicker and easier. They wanted to pay less money in taxes to the state. And they wanted a 1-year suspension of property takeovers so that they could hold on to their farms for a little bit longer. Now, the reason that Shays' rebellion is important is because it's really showing this distinction between the wealthy property-owning class, those who were owed the money, and this poor debtor class, or the mob, as the Founding Fathers called them. That we have this difference, that the mob has gotten out of control, that they are demanding things that they have no right to demand. And so there was really a time to rein in this disorder that the wealthy class had to take back control. They had to balance the power of the states and the power with the central government. And especially since the central government had no power in order to put down Shays' rebellion. Massachusetts had to raise an army in order to bring this rebellion to an end. So this really is a stepping stone to the U.S. Constitution.